There is an instant, almost imperceptible, when the human heart breaks silently. It is the exact second when all the forces that sustained pride give way, and something within us whispers, "Enough." It is not surrender. It is revelation. It is the moment when the spirit, tired of warring with destiny, finally bows before the mystery. At that point, what seemed like defeat becomes the seed of something new, the beginning of true surrender. Carl Jung said that the soul awakens not through conquest, but through surrender. And this is perhaps the hardest lesson of all, because we were educated to fight, to resist, to prove our worth through effort. But there is a limit that separates effort from persistence, and when we cross it, life begins to crumble. Jung saw this collapse as a divine invitation. When the ego dissolves, the self, the deepest and most divine center of being, awakens. It is the birth of a new consciousness, one no longer guided by the logic of control, but by the silent flow of faith. Surrender is not a gesture of weakness. It is an act of spiritual courage. Surrendering to God means relinquishing control of one's own narrative, admitting that we don't know the path, but choosing to walk it nonetheless. It means ceasing to predict tomorrow and learning to inhabit the present with confidence. When the soul reaches this point, something moves in the invisible. Old pains become teachers, losses reveal purpose, and even silence gains voice. The mind that once struggled with questions begins to hear answers coming from a deeper place, where human language cannot reach. But what really happens inside us when we stop resisting? When we stop arguing with life and simply say, yes. In that instant, fear loses its grip. The control that once felt like security proves to be a prison, and what we called self slowly dissolves, giving way to something greater, serene and luminous. Jung saw the psyche as a temple of opposing forces, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, human and divine, that only find harmony when the ego ceases to seek domination. It is in this abandonment that the spirit begins to breathe freely. Surrender doesn't immediately transform the outside world, but it does change the way we see it. The chaos remains, the uncertainties linger, but our perspective changes. Suddenly, suffering is no longer an enemy, but a master. Delay is not punishment, but protection. Doubt is not a failure, but part of the learning process. God doesn't ask us to understand His plan, but to trust the wisdom behind it. And this trust is the ground where the silent miracle of peace germinates. There's an alchemy that occurs when the soul says, "I trust." Time loses its haste. The heart learns to rest amidst storms. Humans cease to be prisoners of their desires and become instruments of the greater will. Jung asserted that this passage, from ego to self, is like crossing a dark river. One must leave the known shore and launch oneself into the unknown. Only then does human beings discover that the invisible is more solid than what can be touched. Surrendering is symbolically dying. It's allowing everything false within us, pride, fear, control, to fall away. But it is in this death that spiritual life blossoms. It's as if, by letting go of the reins, we are seized by a force that has always been there, silent, waiting for space. The ego ceases, the spirit emerges. The self-blind man becomes a seer of the soul, and then faith ceases to be a concept and becomes experience. It is no longer an imposed belief, but a state of being. Faith born of surrender does not depend on promises. It blossoms in the acceptance of mystery. And when faith matures, everything that happens, even the painful, begins to make sense. Synchronicity, as Jung called it, begins to stitch life together with invisible threads. Coincidences cease to be chance. The soul realizes it is guided, even when it doesn't understand the path. The ego, wounded by centuries of control, tries to resist. It fears surrender because it confuses power with existence. But as trust grows, the ego learns to be silent. And when the ego is silent, the spirit speaks. This is the point at which a person stops praying for results and begins praying for understanding. Surrender transforms prayer into communion. It is no longer a request, it is an encounter. And in this encounter, the human and the divine recognize each other. What was once a struggle becomes a dance. What was once a search becomes a return. The soul realizes it has never been separated from God, only distracted. Surrender is the gesture that awakens it from this distraction. But there is a question that remains, echoing softly in the depths of our being. If everything that happens is divine will, why do we still fear losing control? Perhaps because the ego has not yet grasped that what we call loss is, in fact, the beginning of liberation. And it is precisely at this threshold, between fear and faith, between control and surrender, that something great is preparing to be born. A silent call resonates within the soul, asking for more than words, more than prayers, asking for the courage to trust. For whoever truly surrenders himself to God does not become lesser. He becomes vast as the sky. And as this truth unfolds, a new question begins to emerge, even more profound, almost dangerous in its beauty. What happens when man stops just trusting God and starts allowing God to trust him? There are days when everything seems to slip through your fingers. You try to maintain control, but life insists on taking a different path. The clock seems to mock your haste. Doors close, plans fall apart, and within your chest a silent question arises. Why is everything going wrong? It is at this moment that many give up, but some, just a few, stop, take a deep breath, and realize that perhaps it's not the world that's falling apart, but rather the illusion that we once controlled it. Surrender begins this way, subtly, almost imperceptibly, sometimes with loss, other times with waiting, always with an invitation to trust. Carl Jung said that modern man suffers because he has forgotten to talk to his own soul, and it is precisely this forgetfulness that makes him fear the invisible. But when the pain becomes deep enough, it breaks through the noise and creates space for the sacred to speak. Some people only understand this in the midst of a storm, when the doctor has no answer, when a relationship ends, when life changes direction without warning, and suddenly, in the midst of the chaos, something silent happens. An inner voice, soft and firm, whispers, "Trust." This voice doesn't come from outside. It arises from the very place where God dwells. It is the presence that doesn't impose itself, but waits to be acknowledged. Surrender is this recognition. The moment you understand that fighting the flow of life is like trying to hold back the sea with your hands. It's when you let go, and in letting go, something reorganizes. Fear dissolves a little, time slows down, and the air feels different, lighter, more full of meaning. Imagine a woman who unexpectedly lost her job. For weeks, she cried, prayed, and asked for answers. Nothing happened, until, exhausted with asking, she decided to simply give thanks. She gave thanks for what she had, what was, what had yet to come. The next day, without planning it, she met someone who recommended her for a project that would change her life. Coincidence? Jung didn't believe in coincidences. He called it synchronicity, the invisible dialogue between the inner and outer worlds. When the ego is silent, the universe responds. Surrender transforms the way we view everyday life. Small delays no longer irritate. Encounters no longer seem random. Goodbyes no longer tragedies. Everything takes on a symbolic tone. You begin to realize that life is not a sequence of disconnected events, but a living language, full of messages that only reveal themselves when you learn to listen. The spiritual mind lives in a state of listening. It observes, not to judge, but to understand. A man who had always feared loneliness once recounted how, after a great loss, he began waking up every day at 4 in the morning without knowing why. Irritated, he tried to go back to sleep, until one day, he decided not to resist. He got up, made some coffee, sat in silence, and listened to the distant sound of rain. It was at that moment that he felt an inexplicable peace. It wasn't the end of pain, it was the beginning of presence. That emptiness that had so frightened him suddenly became a meeting place. He realized that God had been there all along, waiting for him to stop running away. Carl Jung said that the unconscious speaks through symbols, dreams, and coincidences. When the soul awakens, these signs become guides. A song that plays at the right time, a phrase spoken by a stranger, a delay that prevents you from being in the wrong place. Everything seems part of a greater intelligence. It's as if your entire life were carefully orchestrated to lead you back to your essence. And deep down, it always has been. The spiritual mind understands that there's no need to force fate, just cooperate with it. This doesn't mean passivity, but active trust, the kind of faith that works but doesn't despair, that plans but knows how to let go, that prays but also acts. Surrender doesn't remove you from life, it returns you to it, more lucid, more whole, more awake. And then comes the most beautiful moment, the moment you realize that what has changed is not the world, but your perspective. What was once a burden is now a path. What was once an obstacle is now a direction. What was silence is now an answer. God has never stopped speaking. It was we who, amid the noise of fear, had stopped listening. Surrender teaches you to see the invisible in the visible. It's when you understand that waiting isn't punishment, it's preparation. That God's timing isn't your timing, but it's always the right timing. Jung believed that the self, the divine center of our being, guides each of us like an inner sun, guiding us even when everything seems dark. It's this inner light that silently points the way back to the sacred. And that's why, after surrender, life doesn't get easier. It becomes truer. You still face challenges. You still feel pain. You still experience disappointment. But now there's an invisible thread of trust sustaining every step. Peace doesn't come from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that there's meaning even in what you don't yet understand. And then, in the middle of an ordinary day, in traffic, in a conversation, in a sunset that seems more intense than usual, something inside you whispers again, trust, and you understand that surrender was not a moment. It was the beginning of a way of life. But every deep surrender holds a secret that few have the courage to discover. When you trust God completely, He begins to reveal not what you want, but who you really are. There comes a moment when faith ceases to be theory and becomes a real event within the soul. It is when trust in God crosses the threshold of the mind and touches the body, making every cell seem to know something that reason does not yet understand. Surrender begins to become flesh, breath, gesture. The external world remains the same, but the way you perceive it transforms radically. Everything that once seemed like chaos begins to silently align, as if an invisible intelligence were putting each piece back in its rightful place. Carl Jung said that the self, the divine center of being, reorganizes life when the ego relinquishes control over destiny. It's a subtle but unmistakable adjustment. In this new state, thriving ceases to be about conquest and becomes about harmony. Thriving is when you wake up at peace, even without answers. It's when something inside you knows, even without seeing, and this silent certainty is worth more than any material security. Jung saw the human soul as a field of living energy, constantly called to integration, and surrender is what initiates this process. By letting God lead, you cease to be a fragment and return to wholeness. What was once struggle is now alignment. What was once search is now expression. But can we truly trust this flow without sabotaging the process? Is it possible to live without the urge to control the outcome? These questions reveal the most delicate aspect of surrender. It requires you to renounce not the world, but the image you've created of yourself within it. Surrendering is accepting death to what is false, so that the true can breathe. Some people confuse surrender with passivity, but they are absolute opposites. The passive person waits for something to happen. The surrendered person allows something to pass through them. When you surrender, you begin to act from a different place, no longer from egoic will, but from inspiration. Decisions become calmer, words more precise, and intuition begins to manifest with an almost supernatural clarity. Jung said that intuition is the language of the soul, and when the ego is silenced, this language becomes comprehensible again. Once, a man experiencing a string of failures decided to stop trying to control everything. Instead of planning the impossible, he began waking up every day and simply asking, God, what do you want me to see today? The answer didn't come in grandiose voices or signs. It came in small insights. A stranger's smile, the stillness of a morning, patience in a line. And it was in this state of presence that, unexpectedly, he received the invitation to work on something that united his skills with a purpose he didn't even know he had. Coincidence? Jung would say it was synchronicity, God's answer to the mind he had learned to trust. But what happens within the soul when it begins to realize it is no longer adrift, but rather being guided? The sensation is one of return, as if something familiar, but long forgotten, has resurfaced. It is the reminder that we were made to cooperate with the divine, not to compete with it. The spiritual mind then abandons the fear of scarcity and begins to operate on the frequency of abundance. Everything begins to move more lightly, because the weight of anxiety is replaced by the strength of faith. There's a paradox in surrender that few understand. The more you let go, the more things fall into place. The more you trust, the more life reorganizes itself. Human logic fears emptiness, but emptiness is the womb of miracles. God can only fill what the ego leaves empty. When you let go of being the center, the universe starts to spin correctly again. What if everything you call delay were actually the exact rhythm of divine love? What if every silence from God were an answer that your haste is not yet capable of hearing? These questions don't demand an immediate answer. They demand contemplation. Because mature faith doesn't rush, it waits with confidence. Over time, what was once a search becomes service. What was once a desire becomes a gift. The person who surrenders to God begins to radiate a peace that is not their own. It is borrowed from heaven. Their words heal not by what they say, but by the energy they carry. It is as if the divine breathes through them. Jung asserted that the true process of individuation is the birth of God within the person. When this happens, there is no longer a separation between what you are and what you manifest. The spiritual mind doesn't seek to control outcomes because it already inhabits purpose. It understands that there is an order that doesn't depend on effort, an invisible mathematics that balances all things. You begin to realize that even the falls had a purpose, that even the delays shaped you, that even the silence was part of the music. And then, for the first time, you feel gratitude for everything, including the pain. But are we ready to give thanks for what we don't yet understand? Can we look at pain and call it a teacher? True surrender begins at this point, when the soul accepts that God also speaks through what the ego fears most. At that moment, something inside you awakens intensely. It's as if your heart, previously compressed by the desire to control, opens and lets a light shine through. A deep, serene, and loving lucidity. You understand that prosperity is not about having, but about being. It's when the soul realigns itself with divine purpose, and all that is superfluous dissolves. Carl Jung said that humankind becomes healthy when it learns to live in harmony with the symbol that inhabits it. And the symbol of God within us is trust. And it is this trust that, little by little, transforms you into a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Life then ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a field of creation. You begin to act with lightness, speak with wisdom, and love without fear. And the universe, recognizing the vibration of surrender, responds with generosity. But there is an even greater mystery that begins to unfold on the horizon of the soul, a revelation that few realize until they are ready for the next step. What if total surrender is not the end of the spiritual journey, but the beginning of an even deeper calling, the calling to create together with God? There are moments when the improbable becomes a sign. A simple coincidence repeats itself so often that it ceases to be chance and begins to sound like a call. This is how the universe responds to a surrendered mind. With synchronicities so precise, it would be impossible not to notice an intelligence at work behind the scenes. Carl Jung said that these encounters between the inner and outer are messages from the soul, communications from the self reminding the ego that the divine plan was never lost, merely waiting to be recognized. When you surrender fully to God, even the smallest details take on meaning. A repeating number, a word that appears several times in the same day, a person who arrives at just the right time. Nothing is random. Everything is language. A woman once reported abruptly losing everything, her job, her stability, her direction. For months she prayed for an answer. None came, until in a moment of calm desperation, she simply said, "If it is your will, show me the next step." That same day, she received an unexpected invitation to work on something she had never considered. She accepted intuitively, without logic, without guarantees. Soon she realized that this new path was what she had always sought without knowing it. The improbable had become the perfect plan. Jung said that the unconscious guides us through symbolic events, and that resisting them is like fighting against destiny itself. What she experienced wasn't luck. It was an alignment between faith and surrender. But are we attentive enough to recognize when the invisible touches us? How many times does the impossible knock on the door disguised as loss? How many times does the answer come at the exact moment we decide to stop insisting? The mystery of surrender is this: the more you try to understand, the further you distance yourself. When you accept the unknown, the path reveals itself. The spiritual mind learns to cooperate with this mystery. It doesn't demand proof, but observes carefully. It's like a sailor who trusts the tides, knowing that the sea may seem unstable, but it always takes him where he needs to go. And so it is with God. The common man tries to row against the waves. The surrendered man raises the sails and lets the wind guide him. Jung believed that the true act of faith is to allow the divine unconscious to guide human consciousness. It is at this point that the mind ceases to be merely an instrument and becomes a creative channel. A young artist once said that after a period of silent prayer, she began waking up every morning with melodies ready in her mind. He wrote effortlessly, as if the notes were already waiting to be born. Within a few months, he composed songs that would touch thousands of people. I couldn't explain what was happening. I just said, I feel like I'm not the one writing. It's like something is passing through me. This is the state of one who surrenders. The human mind gives way to the divine mind, and the result is purposeful creation. What was once talent becomes an instrument. Have you ever noticed how the greatest ideas emerge in the moments when we give up thinking? When you let go of control, inspiration strikes. And inspiration is exactly that, spirit in action. The word comes from the Latin inspirare, meaning inner breath. It's God breathing within you. Carl Jung saw creativity as a direct expression of the divine, a way for the soul to communicate truths the mind doesn't yet comprehend. Therefore, surrender isn't the end of action. It's the beginning of creation. There are also curious facts that reinforce this invisible dynamic. Many inventors and scientists claim to receive their discoveries in dreams. Jung documented several cases in which the solution to a scientific problem appeared after the researcher went through a period of exhaustion and surrender, as if the unconscious were saying, now that you've stopped trying to control, I can show you. Surrender opens doors to this inner wisdom which comes not from logic, but from the communion between spirit and matter. But what would happen if we began to apply this trust to the little things? If, instead of insisting on our plans, we sincerely asked, God, what do you want to do through me today? How many silent answers would emerge in the form of coincidences, sudden peace, unexpected directions? Perhaps the miracle is always before us, but fear makes it invisible. When surrender becomes a habit, the improbable becomes the new form of the possible. What once required force now happens by flow. People appear at just the right moment. Opportunities align. Paths that seemed closed open naturally. And you realize it wasn't luck, it was synchronicity. God doesn't create coincidences. He creates convergences. And at that point, something extraordinary happens. Life begins to respond with the same vibration you emit. If there is faith, it returns faith. If there is gratitude, it multiplies. If there is surrender, it guides. Carl Jung said that the outer world is a reflection of the inner world, and when the soul surrenders, the entire universe reorganizes itself to reflect this harmony. But there's one detail few realize, and this is where the story shifts. Surrender isn't just about allowing God to lead the way, it's about allowing Him to reveal your destiny through you. And when that happens, you stop being just someone seeking meaning and become the very instrument through which meaning manifests itself. And then a new question arises, quieter and at the same time more powerful than all the previous ones. Is true surrender not the end of control, but the beginning of co-authorship with God? There comes a time when the path of surrender is intensely tested. Everything seems calm until something unexpected happens, and faith must cease to be talk and become a root. The universe, which once seemed to flow smoothly, suddenly falls silent. Answers fail to come, signs disappear, and the heart finds itself faced with the world's oldest question, do I still trust, even though I see nothing? It is at this point that the spirit matures. Carl Jung said that consciousness only expands when confronted with chaos, and it is precisely in chaos that surrender proves its truth. Peace is no longer a fleeting feeling, but a decision. You choose to trust, even when everything seems contrary. Many people give up here. They believe God has moved away, when in reality He has merely changed frequency. Divine silence is always a preparation. Absence is the disguise of refinement. When God seems distant, it is because He is closer than ever, but now working within, not without. Jung said that the unconscious is the great laboratory of the soul, and that all profound transformation is born from darkness. Therefore, the moment when everything seems to stop is the same moment when the miracle begins to take shape. Total surrender is accepting this darkness with faith, without running away from it, because it is the womb of the new. But what do you do when the invisible seems to forget you? When nothing moves, when time seems to mock your hope? That's when surrender becomes courage. It's no longer about waiting for results, it's about remaining at peace amidst uncertainty. God tests the heart not to see how much you can bear, but to show how much He has already transformed it. When the soul learns to rest even in silence, fear completely loses its power. Once, a man living in a time of apparent failure decided to keep praying, even though he was lacking in energy. For months, nothing changed. Until one morning, when he opened the window, he felt something inexplicable. The same life he had thought empty now seemed sacred. The walls, the sun, the wind, everything carried a silent presence. There was nothing new outside, but something inside him had been ignited. Jung would call this integration, the moment when a person stops seeking God outside and recognizes Him within. Surrender, at last, was complete. What if this is what God does to us? What if He allows emptiness so that fullness can be born? This is the twist few realize. Apparent abandonment is actually the beginning of communion. When everything falls silent, the divine begins to speak in the language of experience. What was once a request becomes a lesson. What was struggle becomes listening. What was resistance becomes gratitude. Surrender doesn't eliminate challenges, but it changes how you navigate them. Before, you asked for the obstacle to disappear. Now, you ask to learn from it. Before, you saw time as an enemy. Now, you recognize it as an ally. Everything that seemed like a delay reveals purpose. Everything that seemed like a loss shows direction. And when this happens, the heart understands something essential. To thrive is to live in a state of trust. Even when the winds change direction, there's a silent, almost invisible turning point that marks spiritual maturity. It's the moment you stop praying, asking, and start praying, offering. From Lord help me to Lord use me. This shift alters the vibration of your soul. It's when your faith stops revolving around your needs and starts revolving around the divine purpose. Life then begins to respond differently. Doors open not only to favor you, but to position you as an instrument. Carl Jung said that humankind only finds meaning when it realizes it is part of something greater than itself. And surrender reveals exactly this. You were never separate from the divine plan. Everything was always happening in favor of your expansion. Even what hurt you was part of the design. The soul that understands this stops resisting life and begins to dance with it. But there's one detail that transforms everything. After true surrender, God begins to act with speed. What was stagnant becomes moving. What seemed impossible realigns. Opportunities arise not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of inner harmony. When the soul vibrates with faith, the entire universe responds in tune. And what was once a distant dream begins to happen with frightening naturalness. The spiritual mind then realizes that prosperity is not about having more, but about being more conscious, more present, more channeled. This is when you understand that purpose is not a destination, it is a state. It is not out there in the future. It is here now, in every gesture, in every thought, in every choice born of trust. And it is at this precise point, when man stops seeking outside and begins to live from within, that something mysterious approaches, ready to be revealed. Because surrender, which seemed like the end of a journey, is merely the preparation for the supreme encounter. And the question that arises, inevitable and sacred, announces the arrival of the final stage. What happens when God, who has always guided your path, finally reveals Himself within you as the one who walks? When the soul finally understands that it doesn't need to understand everything to live in peace, something within it changes forever. The heart stops chasing the future and begins to inhabit the present with serenity. The mind, previously filled with noise, becomes a temple, and it is in this silent space that the spirit begins to rule. Carl Jung said that the person who knows themselves deeply finds, in their own unconscious, the living presence of the divine. Surrendering, then, is discovering that God was never distant, but waiting for the moment when you would be still enough to hear Him. The practice of surrender is daily. It's not a one-time event, but a constant exercise in trust. Every day, upon waking, there's a choice to be made, to live guided by fear or guided by faith. And the difference between the two lies in a simple internal gesture, that of letting go of control, letting go of anxiety, letting go of the need to know what comes next. Each time you let go, your mind expands and your spirit takes the helm. And over time you realize that life hasn't become easier, but it has become clearer. Everything makes sense when the mind submits to divine wisdom. But how can we put this into practice? Start by observing our thoughts. When worry arises, don't fight it, just notice it. Tell yourself, I choose to trust. When you feel fear, take a deep breath and remind yourself, God is leading, even if I can't see the way. When something gets out of control, transform your reaction into prayer. Lord, teach me what I need to learn here. This is the exercise of surrender. It's simple, yet profound. It's the daily practice of transforming resistance into active faith. There is also a powerful secret. The spiritual mind seeks not to dominate the world, but to dominate itself. True power lies not in controlling events, but in not being controlled by them. Carl Jung said that he who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens. When you learn to turn inward with confidence, you discover that every spiritual response arises from silence, not from haste. And in this state, fear loses its hold, the ego dissolves, and the spirit governs with wisdom. Total surrender turns your mind into a divine instrument. What was once confused thinking becomes clear direction. What was once doubt transforms into intuition. Ideas begin to come with purpose and actions carry power. You stop acting on impulse and start acting on inspiration. God doesn't just guide you, He thinks through you. And everything born from this union of faith and conscience multiplies, because it is already born blessed. Over time, life begins to reorganize itself. The same situations that once hurt you now strengthen you. The same challenges that seemed unfair now shape you. Surrender transforms your story from the inside out, without noise, without false promises, only with the certainty that God has always been guiding every detail. Thriving, then, stops being about having more and becomes about being whole. It's when your will aligns with God's will, and everything that is yours begins to find you. And if you're wondering where to begin, start with your thoughts, because it's in the mind that the Spirit plants the seeds of miracles. Train yourself to think with faith, speak with wisdom, and act with gratitude. Don't ask God to rush, ask for purpose. The right time exists, and it's being prepared as you trust. Surrender isn't the end of power, it's the beginning of true mastery. Human control limits you, but surrender sets you free. So, right now, close your eyes and say to yourself, I surrender my mind to God. Say it even if it's silently, even if your faith is still small, because He hears even what the heart cannot yet express in words. This is the seed of a new cycle, and if this message spoke to you, like this video, share it with someone who needs peace, and write in the comments, even anonymously, your phrase of faith. I surrender my mind to God, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of awareness, faith, and purpose. Because when the ego is silent, the Spirit speaks. And when the Spirit speaks, all of life aligns.